It was a cold winter night in Chicago, the kind where even the strongest of the city's skyscrapers seemed to bend under the weight of the icy winds. The city had been hit hard by an early snowstorm, coating every street with a thick blanket of white. The usual bustle of cars and pedestrians had slowed to a standstill as families huddled inside, seeking warmth and shelter. Yet in one part of the city, behind the ivy-covered walls of a spacious suburban home, a nightmare was quietly unfolding, one that would soon shake the entire city to its core. The house was eerily quiet, a silence broken only by the soft crackling of a fire in the living room. Inside, the Masons, a family known for their wealth and prominence, appeared to live the perfect life. Mark Mason, a successful businessman, and his wife, Judge Elaine Mason, were well-respected members of the Chicago elite. Their two children, a teenage son named Michael and a younger daughter, Emily, lived comfortable lives that many would envy. To outsiders, the Masons had everything: power, money, and the kind of happiness that others could only dream of. But beneath the surface, things were not as they seemed. There were secrets, dark, twisted secrets, that no one could have ever guessed. Secrets that would ultimately lead to one of the most gruesome acts of betrayal the city had ever witnessed. It all started on the night of the Mason family's tragic deaths. The police were called to the scene early the following morning after neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the house in the middle of the night. When the officers arrived, they were met with a gruesome sight. Mark Mason lay lifeless in the entryway, a bullet wound to his head. Emily, the young daughter, was found in her bedroom, the bed soaked in blood. Michael was discovered in the kitchen, his body sprawled across the floor, a knife embedded in his chest. And, most shockingly of all, Judge Elaine Mason was found standing in the kitchen, covered in her family's blood, holding the murder weapon, an antique revolver that had been in her family for generations. At first, it seemed like a clear-cut case of a domestic dispute gone wrong. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this was no ordinary crime. The evidence seemed too perfect, too planned. And as seasoned detective Sean Harris dug deeper into the Mason family's past, he uncovered a chilling story of deception, betrayal, and a twisted desire to protect a dark secret. What could possibly drive a respected judge to murder her own family? Was this simply an act of a deranged woman, or was there something more sinister at play? Detective Harris was determined to find out. Detective Sean Harris sat at his desk, the morning sun barely peeking through the office window as he reviewed the crime scene photos. The Masons were a well-known family in Chicago, their reputation etched into the city's elite social circles. Mark Mason, a self-made millionaire with a ruthless edge in business, and his wife, Judge Elaine Mason, a powerful figure on the bench, were people who commanded respect. Their children, Michael and Emily, had attended prestigious schools, and their lives seemed to unfold like pages from a perfect family story. But now Harris had a different story to uncover. Harris was no stranger to the complexities of human nature. Having been a detective for over 15 years, he had seen it all. Murders born out of jealousy, greed, revenge, and rage. But this case felt different. Something didn't sit right about the whole thing. It wasn't just the bloodbath, but the way the scene had been orchestrated. Everything was too clean, too neat, and there was one glaring detail. Judge Elaine Mason appeared to be the only one left alive, standing there in the midst of the carnage. The initial theory pointed toward an act of revenge or a financial dispute. But as Harris examined the evidence, he saw a bigger, darker picture emerging. He began his investigation by talking to the neighbors. Most of them described the Masons as an ideal family, but a few had noticed odd behaviors in the months leading up to the murders. One neighbor, Mrs. Thomas, a retired school teacher, had seen Michael coming home late one evening with a bruised face, though he never spoke about it. Another neighbor, who worked as a lawyer in the same building as Judge Elaine, mentioned that she had recently become reclusive, taking fewer public cases and keeping a lower profile in the courts. But the most important lead came from the Mason family's housekeeper, a woman named Rosa Martinez. She was the first to arrive at the scene on the morning of the murder, and it was her frantic 911 call that had alerted the authorities. As Detective Harris sat across from her in the small interrogation room, Rosa nervously wrung her hands. Rosa, I need you to tell me everything you know about the Mason family, Harris said, his voice calm but firm. Rosa hesitated, then nodded, her eyes darting around the room. I've worked for them for years, she began, her voice trembling. They were always a good family. But in the last few months, something changed. Judge Mason, she started acting strange. She seemed more stressed. And Mark was always a bit harsh, but lately he became obsessed with keeping things perfect. And Michael, she trailed off, biting her lip. What about Michael? Harris pressed. Rosa looked down at her hands. I don't know how to say this, but Michael wasn't always who he seemed. I don't know the details, but there was tension between him and Judge Mason. They didn't get along like they used to. He was rebellious, and I think he knew things he shouldn't. Harris's heart quickened. What was she saying? There was something between Michael and his mother, something more than just the usual teenage rebellion. Rosa, tell me more, Harris urged, leaning forward. She hesitated, glancing at the door as if to make sure no one was listening. I think Michael found out something about Judge Mason's past, Rosa whispered, something that she was trying to hide. He was trying to make her pay, but I don't think she was going to let that happen. Detective Harris sat back, processing what he had just heard. Michael knew something that could ruin his mother, something so dangerous that it had put the entire family in jeopardy. But what could it be? He asked Rosa if she had noticed anything unusual in the past week or two. Rosa's eyes widened. Yes, I saw Judge Mason and Michael arguing in the kitchen last week. It got heated. They were shouting at each other. And then Michael stormed off. I think that was the breaking point. After that, things got worse. Harris knew he needed to talk to Judge Elaine Mason to get her side of the story. But before he could, he received a call that would change everything. Detective Harris? The voice on the other end of the line was urgent. We found something. Harris's pulse quickened. What did you find? The family's financial records, the officer said. It looks like Judge Mason was hiding a large sum of money in a private account, one that Mark didn't know about. And there's more. We found an address for a location outside the city, one that she visited several times in the past few months. It's a small property in a rural area, near the edge of town. Keep digging, Harris ordered. I'm heading there now. This discovery raised more questions than answers. What was Judge Elaine hiding? And why had she been sneaking around behind her family's back? Harris couldn't shake the feeling that there was something even darker lurking beneath the surface. He needed to find the answers. Answers that could explain why a mother would murder her own family. But as the investigation moved forward, the detective would come to realize that the truth was far more twisted and shocking than he could have ever imagined. The drive to the rural property was quiet, the only sound being the low hum of Detective Harris's car engine as it cut through the thick fog rolling in from the nearby forest. It was a stark contrast to the chaos of the city he had left behind. Chicago with its constant noise, crowded streets, and people rushing in all directions. Here in the quiet outskirts, things felt slower, almost unnervingly peaceful. But that peacefulness was an illusion, Harris knew. What awaited him at the end of this road was something far more sinister. The rural property wasn't much to look at. A small, run-down house with faded white paint sat in the middle of an overgrown yard. The driveway was cracked and the mailbox sagged, barely clinging to its post. Harris parked his car a few yards away from the house, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of life. The air was thick with tension, and Harris couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. He made his way up the cracked path to the front door and knocked. There was no answer. Harris tried the handle. It was unlocked. Cautiously, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single bulb hanging above the kitchen table. Dust settled in the corners, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. Harris moved through the house, his shoes creaking on the old wooden floors. As he walked into the living room, something caught his eye, a picture frame on the mantel. It was a family photo, Mark, Elaine, Michael, and Emily, smiling and happy, taken at a family gathering. Harris knew that this image, this family, was no longer the same. The perfect image of suburban bliss had been shattered by bloodshed. He continued to investigate the small home, looking for anything that could tie it to Judge Elaine Mason. He checked the mail on the counter, but most of it was old junk. His eyes landed on a folder hidden under a stack of papers. The folder was marked with the word private in bold red letters. Inside were documents, legal papers, personal notes, and something that made Harris's blood run cold. A set of photos. They were photographs of Michael, taken in the last few months. At first, Harris didn't understand the significance, but as he flipped through the photos, he realized that something wasn't right. Michael wasn't alone in these pictures. A woman, Judge Elaine, was with him in every single shot. They were together in restaurants, in parks, in secluded spots, always in the shadows, trying to stay hidden. Harris's mind raced. The affair was no longer a theory, it was real. Elaine Mason, a respected judge, had been having an illicit relationship with her own son. This twisted revelation made everything fall into place. It explained the tension between mother and son that Rosa had mentioned. It explained why Michael had been so rebellious and why the family had been slowly falling apart. But why had Elaine gone to such lengths to keep it a secret? And why had she been willing to kill her own family to protect it? Harris sat down at the kitchen table, his thoughts swirling. The affair had been going on for months, and now it was clear that Elaine was desperate to keep it hidden, desperate enough to go to extreme lengths. She had been trying to hide the pregnancy, a pregnancy that she had been keeping from her husband, Mark. And that, Harris realized, was the key to understanding the murders. Just as he was about to gather his thoughts and leave the house, Harris heard a car pull up. He looked out the window and saw a figure emerge from the shadows, a woman in a long coat, walking briskly toward the house. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized her. It was Judge Elaine Mason. Elaine's footsteps echoed in the silence as she approached the house. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, as though she hadn't slept in days. She paused at the door, her hand hovering over the handle, as though she was unsure whether to enter. The woman who had once been a pillar of the community now looked nothing like the confident, self-assured judge that Chicago had known. This woman was broken, desperate, and terrified. Harris didn't waste a second. He stepped forward, blocking her from entering. "Judge Mason," he said calmly but firmly, "we need to talk." Elaine froze, her eyes wide with fear. For a moment, she said nothing, just stared at him as if trying to figure out whether she could outrun him. But then her shoulders slumped, and she let out a deep sigh. The facade, the mask she had worn for so long, seemed to crack. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I never wanted any of this." Harris's eyes narrowed as he took a step closer. "You killed your family to cover up a secret you were too afraid to let anyone find out." Elaine shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I thought I could fix everything. I thought I could hide it all, but it spiraled out of control." Her voice broke as she spoke. "I didn't want to hurt anyone. I couldn't let anyone know what I had done." "Tell me everything," Harris urged. "Start from the beginning." Elaine's lips trembled as she began to speak, her words falling out in a rushed, desperate stream. "I met Michael when he was young, when I was still married to Mark. He had always been a sweet boy, so full of promise. But then as he got older, he changed. And She paused, trying to steady her breath. "I found myself drawn to him. I know it's wrong. I know it's sick. But I couldn't help it. I tried to stop, but the more I tried, the more I needed him." Her confession hung in the air, thick with shame. Harris's stomach churned as he realized just how deep the twisted web of lies went. Elaine had been having an affair with her son for months, and now she was pregnant with his child. The family had begun to unravel, and Elaine had feared that the truth would come out. So she had made a choice that led to murder. "I couldn't let Mark find out," she whispered. "He would have killed me. And Michael. Michael wanted the truth to come out. He wanted to tell everyone. I had no choice. I had to stop him." Harris shook his head, disgusted by the woman before him. "You had no choice? You killed your own family to protect your secret. That's not a choice. That's a lie." Elaine sank to her knees, her body racked with sobs. "I didn't know what else to do. I was trapped." As Harris stood there looking down at the broken woman, he knew that this case was far from over. Elaine Mason might have confessed, but there was still so much more to uncover. The twisted story of couldn't understand. We can't let this get out, she said quietly, her eyes still on Michael. We have to cover it up, all of it. Mark looked at her, his face a mask of disbelief. What are you talking about? He's dead, Elaine. There's no covering this up. Elaine's eyes narrowed, and she reached for the gun still lying on the floor. We make it look like a robbery. We get rid of the evidence. We'll say we were attacked. We'll say we were both victims here. Mark stared at her for a moment, clearly shocked by her words. But then, after what seemed like an eternity, he nodded. Fine. We'll do it your way, he said quietly. And that was the plan. The footage ended there. The last frame showing Elaine standing over Michael's body, her face a mixture of sorrow and cold determination. Harris watched the recording over and over again, his mind spinning with what he had just witnessed. The argument, the shooting, the cover-up, it was all there. Elaine had been complicit in her husband's actions, but the true horror lay in her involvement after the murder. As Harris processed the footage, he knew one thing for sure. Mark Mason had killed Michael, but it was Elaine who had orchestrated the aftermath. The murder of the Mason family was a tangled web of lies, betrayal, and bloodshed. And now Harris had everything he needed to bring the full truth to light. Detective Harris sat at his desk, staring at the evidence in front of him. The footage from the hidden camera had changed everything. It wasn't just a crime of passion anymore. It was a planned cover-up, orchestrated by Elaine Mason herself. But the most chilling part? She had taken control of the situation without hesitation. She hadn't even flinched when deciding to erase the rest of her family. Harris rubbed his temples, exhaustion settling in. He needed to put everything together. The bodies of Mark, the daughters, and Michael were found inside the house. The crime scene had been staged to look like a home invasion, but Mark hadn't killed the girls. That much was clear. So who did? Harris rewound the footage again. The last frame showed Elaine standing over Michael's body, gripping the gun. The screen flickered, the recording ending abruptly. He exhaled sharply. He needed to know what happened after that. The medical examiner's report had provided a timeline of death for each family member. Michael was shot first, around 9:30 p.m. Mark Mason was killed next, but his time of death was estimated at 10:15 p.m. That left a 45-minute window where Elaine had done something else before killing him. Harris pulled out his notes. There had been no sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle. The girls had been found in their beds, tucked in as if they had gone to sleep peacefully. But the autopsy revealed that wasn't the case. The cause of death? Poison. Elaine had poisoned her daughters. Harris gritted his teeth. This was no crime of impulse. This was planned. Jesus Christ, he muttered under his breath. The toxicology report showed traces of a powerful sedative in the girls' systems. They had ingested it through their dinner, most likely. Elaine had made sure they wouldn't wake up to witness the carnage. She had killed them first, then let Mark kill Michael, and then finished the job by killing Mark. But why? Harris had been in law enforcement long enough to know that people killed for 3 reasons: money, revenge, or to keep a secret. Elaine Mason's motive had to be in one of those. Harris needed to dig deeper. Elaine was a respected judge, someone with power and influence. But the pregnancy changed everything. It was the biggest secret she had, and if it got out, it would ruin her life. The father of the child was her own 16-year-old brother, Mark Jr. That meant incest, statutory rape, and a scandal that would destroy her career and reputation forever. So she did what she thought was the only way out. She silenced everyone who knew. Michael had found out first, and he confronted Mark Sr. That's what led to the first killing, but Mark Sr. hadn't been innocent either. Harris had gone through the Mason family records. Mark Sr. had a long history of abuse, though it had never been proven in court. There had been whispers, rumors, but no one had come forward with enough evidence to put him away. Elaine had grown up in that toxic environment. Maybe in some twisted way, she saw killing them as a form of taking control. But no matter how she justified it, the truth was clear. She had murdered her own family to keep her dark secret from coming to light. Harris needed more proof to nail Elaine in court. A confession wouldn't be enough. If she got a good lawyer, she could claim coercion, temporary insanity, anything to reduce her sentence. He needed something solid. That's when he got a call from his partner, Detective Monroe. "You're going to want to see this," Monroe said, his voice tense. "We pulled some financial records, and you won't believe what we found." Harris grabbed his coat and rushed over to the precinct. Monroe was waiting for him, a stack of documents in his hands. "We traced Elaine's credit card transactions from the week before the murders," Monroe said, spreading out the receipts on the desk. "She bought a sedative, same one found in the girl's toxicology reports. And here's the kicker. She bought a burner phone." Harris frowned. "A burner phone?" "Yep," Monroe said, nodding. "And we traced the number. She made 3 calls the night of the murders. One to her own cell phone, one to a pharmacy, and one to an unknown number." Harris picked up the report. "Who's the unknown number registered to?" Monroe gave him a grim look. "Mark Jr." Elaine had called her brother that night, the same brother she had been sleeping with. Harris felt his stomach twist. Was Mark Jr. involved in the murders? Or was Elaine making sure he kept quiet? There was only one way to find out. They needed to find Mark Jr. Mark Jr. hadn't been seen since the murders. He had vanished without a trace. The last known sighting of him was 2 days before the killings, at a gas station near the Mason home. After that, nothing. But now with the phone records, they had a lead. Monroe and Harris tracked the burner phone's last signal. It pinged from a motel on the outskirts of Chicago. It was an old, run-down place, the kind of spot where people went to disappear. They arrived at the motel late at night. The place was dimly lit, the neon sign flickering. Harris knocked on the door of room 12, his hand resting on his gun. No answer. He knocked again. "Mark Jr.? Chicago PD. Open up." Silence. Then from inside they heard movement. A chair scraping. A quick shuffle of footsteps. Harris exchanged a look with Monroe. "We're going in," he said. Monroe kicked the door open. The room was dark, reeking of sweat and cigarette smoke. And there, in the corner, was Mark Jr. He was curled up against the wall, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. But it was the thing in his hands that made Harris freeze. A pregnancy test. Positive. Mark Jr. looked up at them, his hands shaking. "She lied," he whispered. "She lied about everything." Harris narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" Mark Jr. swallowed hard. "Elaine, she said we had to keep it secret, that no one would understand. She said she loved me, but when I told her I wanted to keep the baby, she changed. She said I was a problem, that I needed to disappear." Harris felt the weight of the case settle on his shoulders. Elaine Mason wasn't just covering up a crime. She had manipulated her own brother, murdered her family, and was ready to kill again to keep her secret. And if Mark Jr. hadn't run, he would have been her next victim. Harris turned to Monroe. "We have everything we need." The case was about to explode, and Elaine Mason was going down. The Chicago skyline loomed overhead as Detective Harris and Monroe drove toward the courthouse. The morning air was thick with tension. After gathering enough evidence, they had secured an arrest warrant for Judge Elaine Mason. This was going to be one of the most high-profile arrests in the city's history. Harris tapped his fingers on the dashboard, his mind racing. He had arrested killers before, gang members, drug dealers, career criminals, but never a sitting judge. Elaine Mason was powerful, well-connected, and dangerous. He had no doubt she would fight back. "She won't go quietly," Monroe said, breaking the silence. "She's a judge. She knows every loophole in the book." "Doesn't matter," Harris said. "We have enough to bury her." They pulled into the parking garage beneath the courthouse. A team of officers was already waiting, armed and ready. This had to be done carefully. No room for mistakes. The last thing they needed was for Elaine to slip through their fingers. Elaine Mason sat in her chambers, reviewing court documents when Harris and Monroe walked in. She glanced up, her expression calm, composed. "Detectives," she said smoothly. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Harris didn't answer. He pulled out the arrest warrant and placed it on her desk. "Elaine Mason, you're under arrest for the murders of Mark Mason, Michael Mason, and your daughters." Elaine blinked, but her face remained neutral. Then she laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You're joking," she said, shaking her head. "This is ridiculous." Monroe stepped forward. "You can play innocent all you want, Judge, but we have evidence, security footage, toxicology reports, financial records, and phone calls that put you at the center of this." Elaine's smile faltered. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said quietly. "This will ruin you." Harris leaned in. "No, Elaine, this ruins you." For the first time, her confidence cracked. Her fingers tightened around the pen in her hand. Her breathing grew unsteady. Then, in a swift motion, she grabbed a letter opener from her desk and lunged at Monroe. The room exploded into chaos. Monroe dodged, grabbing her wrist before she could stab him. Harris tackled her, slamming her onto the desk. Papers flew everywhere. The other officers rushed in, forcing her arms behind her back. "Let me go," Elaine shrieked. "You don't understand. I had no choice." Harris ignored her, snapping the cuffs onto her wrists. "Elaine Mason, you're under arrest. You have the right to remain silent." "I had no choice," she screamed. Harris paused, looking into her wild, desperate eyes. "Then tell me, Elaine, why did you do it?" For a moment she hesitated. Then she exhaled shakily. "Because I was afraid." Elaine sat in the interrogation room, her hands cuffed to the table. She no longer looked like the composed judge she once was. Her makeup was smudged, her hair disheveled. The mask had finally cracked. Harris and Monroe sat across from her. The room was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Harris folded his arms. "Start talking." Elaine sighed, staring down at her hands. "I was pregnant with Mark Jr.'s baby. If anyone found out, my career, my life, it would be over." Monroe scoffed. "So you killed your whole family to keep it a secret?" Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't want to. I just wanted a way out." She took a deep breath. "Michael found out first. He saw the pregnancy test and confronted me. He threatened to tell Mark. I panicked." Harris clenched his jaw. "So you let your husband kill him?" Elaine nodded. "Yes. And after Michael was dead, I knew Mark would find out eventually. I couldn't risk it. So, I poisoned the girls before they could suspect anything. And when Mark came upstairs, I shot him before he could question me." Monroe shook his head. "And Mark Jr.? Were you planning to kill him too?" Elaine swallowed hard. "I didn't want to, but when he said he wanted to keep the baby, I realized he would never stay quiet. He would tell someone, and I couldn't have that." Harris leaned forward. "Where were you planning to go?" Elaine hesitated. I had money stashed away, a plane ticket to Mexico. I was going to disappear, but Mark Jr. ran first," Monroe added. "And now here we are." Elaine slumped in her chair, defeated. Harris turned off the recorder. "We're done here." Elaine Mason was charged with 5 counts of murder. The trial was one of the most sensational in Chicago's history. The media painted her as a monster, a woman who had killed her entire family to cover up a dark secret. Mark Jr. testified against her, detailing the abuse and manipulation he had suffered. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Elaine Mason was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Harris watched the verdict from the back of the courtroom. Justice had been served, but the case would haunt him for the rest of his life. Because deep down, he knew Elaine Mason wasn't just a murderer. She was a victim too. Months passed since Elaine Mason's trial and conviction. Chicago, though still shocked by the murders, began to heal. The media circus around the Mason family tragedy had died down. But for Detective Harris, the case continued to linger in the back of his mind. It wasn't just the brutality of the murders that haunted him. It was Elaine's confession, the way she had described how she'd killed her family out of fear and desperation. But even after the conviction, Harris wasn't satisfied. There was something about the whole case that still didn't sit right with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something hidden just below the surface. The detective had seen it before. Cases where people confessed but left out crucial details. Something didn't add up. As he sat at his desk one evening, going over case files for another case, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Monroe. The subject line read, "We missed something." Harris opened the message, his eyes scanning the text quickly. Detective Harris, I think we missed something in the investigation. Remember the security footage from the Mason house? We never fully reviewed the footage from the backyard. I think there's something important in there. Let me know if you want to take a look. Harris's heart raced. They had reviewed almost every inch of the footage from the Mason house when they were investigating, but the backyard footage? He'd completely forgotten about it. He grabbed his coat and rushed out of his office, making his way to the evidence room. Harris met Monroe in the evidence room where they pulled up the backyard security footage. As the video began, it showed the usual footage of the backyard, a snow-covered lawn, the swings hanging motionless in the winter chill. The camera angle shifted slightly, capturing the back door leading to the Mason family's kitchen. At first it looked normal, but then Harris spotted something unusual. At the edge of the frame, near the back gate, a figure appeared. It was quick, almost imperceptible. Harris paused the video. He leaned in closer, replaying the footage at a slower speed. There, right in the corner of the frame, was the unmistakable figure of a person slipping into the backyard, carrying something large under their arm. The figure was masked, but the way they moved was deliberate, purposeful. "That's not one of the family members," Monroe muttered, pointing to the figure. "No," Harris agreed. "That's someone else." They watched in silence as the figure in the video moved toward the house. The man or woman approached the back door, pausing to look around before slipping inside. "That's not Elaine," Monroe said, his voice thick with suspicion. Harris's mind raced. This wasn't part of the original case. The figure in the footage hadn't been on any of the original reports. If this was someone else, someone who had been in the house that night, it meant Elaine's confession might have been incomplete, if not entirely false. "What do we do with this?" Monroe asked, his voice steady, despite the shock in his eyes. "We need to find out who that person is," Harris said, "and we need to figure out why they were there." Harris and Monroe worked tirelessly for the next few weeks, following every lead and digging deeper into the security footage. They consulted with tech experts who were able to enhance the video, revealing more details of the mysterious figure. The person was wearing a dark jacket, gloves, and a mask, which made it nearly impossible to identify them by appearance. But they noticed something. As the person moved toward the back door, the way they walked, slightly off balance, favoring one leg, was odd. This detail became their key. They cross-referenced the footage with medical records, city hospital visits, and even local police databases. It took days, but eventually they found a match. The figure in the video was none other than Officer Terry Gibbons, a close colleague of Elaine Mason. He had been part of the local police force for years, and, as it turned out, had been having an affair with her for months. The connection was shocking, but it explained a lot. When Harris and Monroe confronted Gibbons, the truth finally began to unravel. At first, Gibbons denied everything, but once Harris showed him the enhanced footage, the officer's composure cracked. He confessed in a matter of moments. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," Gibbons said, his voice trembling. "Elaine, she wanted to keep the affair a secret. She was scared, afraid that if people found out, it would ruin her career. So she came to me for help. I didn't know what to do." Gibbons explained that, on the night of the murders, he had come over to the Mason house to discuss the affair with Elaine. They were supposed to talk and make a plan to move forward, perhaps even run away together. But things escalated when Michael Mason found out about the affair and confronted Elaine. Gibbons claimed he had never intended for it to go that far. In the chaos, it had been easy for Elaine to manipulate the situation. She told Gibbons that she needed his help to get rid of Michael, and he complied, too afraid to say no. Gibbons had never been involved in the killings of the Mason children, but he had helped Elaine cover it up. He'd gone back to the house that night after the murders to help her hide the evidence and make sure no one would connect her to the crimes. His role in the cover-up had been crucial, but it had also made him an accomplice. Elaine had manipulated him, just as she had manipulated everyone around her. She had killed her family to protect her secret, but she had relied on Gibbons to help her tie up the loose ends. Gibbons was arrested and charged with being an accessory to murder. He was sent to trial, where the full scope of his involvement in the Mason family's deaths was revealed. His testimony, combined with the security footage, helped secure a guilty verdict for both him and Elaine. Elaine Mason's life sentence was upheld, but with the addition of Gibbons's conviction, it became clear that the true mastermind behind the murders had been her all along. Gibbons had been nothing more than a pawn in her deadly game. As Harris sat back in his office, reflecting on the case, he felt a mix of relief and unease. Justice had been served, but the story of the Mason family was a tragic one that would haunt him for the rest of his career. The world would never know the full extent of Elaine Mason's manipulation, but Harris would, and that he realized was enough.